The first thing we'll do is measure this PVC pipe, and we want a section to cut at 16.5 inches. Next thing we'll do is mark a center line. We'll do that by laying a piece of plywood up against our PVC pipe and then drawing a line lengthwise where the two meet. We're going to place 2 marks on this end of the flute. This will be the end that is blown through. The first mark we're going to make at 3 inches, but we're going to make it over on the side of the flute. The next mark will be 1 inch up from that, or 2 inches from this end to the second mark, also on the side of the flute. Now we're going to start just above our 2-inch mark, about a 1/4 inch overlapping. Place our file as close to 90 degrees as possible, and we want to file a flat spot on this flute. And we want the flat spot to continue about a 1/2 inch or more beyond our 3-inch mark. So it starts about a 1/4 inch above our 2-inch mark and extends about a 1/2 inch beyond our 3-inch mark. And just put some pressure down, keep your file at 90 degrees, and keep filing. What we want is a nice, smooth, flat spot that gradually returns to the roundness of the flute below the 3-inch mark. What we're looking for is a flat spot at our 3-inch hole that is at least a 1/16 of an inch or more wider than this standard needle file. The width of this needle file is 3/16 of an inch. We're getting close already, but it needs a little more. That's about right there. Next we want to put a 9/64 inch drill bit into our drill. And we want to use our side marks. Let me show you those real quick. Our side marks, this was the 2-inch mark, this is the 3-inch mark. We're going to use those for a reference. And just behind each of those lines, we're going to drill our 9/64 inch hole. I'm going to give this a little more work back here because I want this to be at least as wide as it is up here. Looks good. So as you can see, I've got a shape that gradually gets thinner as it goes toward the other end of the flute, roughly at 90 degrees straight across from the center line that I made earlier. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit off at this point, you can make your adjustments later. So using my 2 and 3 inch marks on the side of the flute as a guide,
I'm going to place my drill as close to the center of the flat spot behind the 3-inch mark, just behind it, and drill one hole. And then I'm going to go back to the 2-inch mark just behind it and drill my other hole. Now I'm going to take a round needle file and I'm going to make these holes oval by making the hole travel this way and this way by putting pressure in those directions while filing with the needle file. It takes a little bit to get it started, but what you want to do here is be careful not to go too far. You only need this to be wide enough to get your flat needle file into the flat area so you can make those square. So using a little pressure and motion, just elongating that hole into an oval. Continuing this way, and try to keep in mind that these areas here and here need to stay even, so you can use your file to even those out as you make the hole large enough. Try not to gouge the sides of your flute while you're doing this. It's easy to slip out and make scratches on it, but it's no big deal if you do. You can get rid of those later, and I'll show you how. So every now and then just take a check of your needle file to see if you're wide enough. And as soon as you can get your needle file in there, you want to file this way and that way and make a flat little square opening. You don't want to go beyond your 3-inch mark. Try to get it right up to the 3-inch line. And once you get it nice and flat, move to the other side and file in the other direction. We'll try to do this so the camera can see. So there I've got it somewhat square, but you can see that the ends are a little bit slanted, but that's okay. We'll take care of that in a minute. So now, with another file that comes in the needle set, I'm going to use this little square pointed file, and I'm going to come in and square up this hole into more of a perfect rectangle by just getting rid of those corners that were a little bit off from the initial creation of the hole. And less is more when you're doing this. Just go a little bit and check it, and go a little and check it, because some of the excess that can be hanging off can be a little deceiving. And then take a good look at it and see if it needs a little finishing work. And this one looks like it's a little slanted, this line, so I'm just taking a little off of that and fixing that. Doing the same on the back in the opposite direction. Just angling my file a little bit until I can get these holes to square up nicely. And that looks pretty good for that one. Now we're going to repeat the same process in the back. At the 2-inch mark, with the hole that we drilled, I'm just going to elongate this hole, making it a little more oval. spider webs in my flute. So like I said, just continue pulling it this way toward the 2-inch line, making sure you're staying behind it and trying to keep it as square as possible, and then push away to get it closer to the other line. Just until you can fit your needle file in there, your flat needle file. And these needle files come in packs of 6, and they're relatively inexpensive at any home store where you can buy this particular kind of PVC pipe, this 1/2-inch PVC pipe. Make sure you don't get Schedule 40 PVC because it has a much thicker wall than this pipe does, and it'll sound completely different. So just file a little bit, check it, keeping this distance as close to the same as you can, because you want it to be even when you finish the hole. And it's easier to do, but it's easy to make the hole too large, so make sure you check your flat file often so you don't make your hole too large. Now we got this ready for the flat file. We're going to do the same thing, just pull in this direction toward the end of the flute until I get even with that 2-inch line, trying to keep it at 90 degrees. That looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go to the other side of the hole and push a little pressure toward the blowing end of the flute to square that up. The idea here is to get both of these hole openings to be nice square rectangles of about the same size. Gotta get this spider web out of here. It's bugging me. Beetle, whatever it is. Okay, this needs a little more work. Almost done with these 2 holes. And this is probably the most difficult part of making one of these PVC flutes, is just getting these 2 holes to match before moving on to the next steps. Now I'm going to go back to my small squared file to give these corners a little more definition and make it into more of a straight 90-degree rectangle. And this is not rocket science. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the more time you spend doing this and making it just right and not overdoing it, the better your flute will sound when you finish it. Okay, we're looking pretty good here. I'm going to give that a little more finishing work. Again, I'm just trying to keep these as rectangular as I can, and try not to overdo it. We don't want huge holes here because then your flute will end up sounding very breathy. Give it a little finishing touch with my file. So once you have your 2 holes, this one and this one, roughly looking the same dimensions, just 2 little rectangles, and they are approximately a heavy 3/16 in width and about a heavy 1/8 of an inch wide. So, and the flat spot is 3/8 wide, probably at its widest. Okay. So now what we're going to do is create the portion of this 3-inch sound hole that actually cuts the air when you blow through it. And to do that, we're going to angle the inside of it by holding our needle file at an angle and giving a light upward pressure while filing, just until we get to the edge. And this doesn't take much, so be cautious and don't overdo this. But the more angle you get, the sharper it will be. But you also want to avoid angling this too much. It doesn't matter if you give it a little angle, that might even help, but you don't want it to be filed to take off material here. You just want to flatten that underside edge of this particular lip right here. That one right. This lip right here, you want to be sharp. This one can be flat, and these don't need any attention more at all. Once we've got that done, we want to take something of a smaller diameter and wrap some sandpaper around it, tape it a little bit, wrap it around, and put it into this hole to sand off the underside that might have left some shavings of some kind. For that, I'm using a ground stake wrapped with 100 grit sandpaper, and I'm just pushing it in, and now I'm going to go ahead and go through to get rid of any more of those bugs that might have been in there, or spiders. And I'm just sanding it back and forth, not really removing any material from the underside, but just smoothing out the areas where the drill may have left some burrs, or the files may have left some burrs. Once I've got that done, I'm going to go in and just barely clean up the edges, maybe just with one stroke. And remember, I just want to do this enough to get rid of any excess material that was left behind from the filing process and the drills. So once we got that done, this end of the flute is where you're going to make your sound. And you can go ahead and hit that with some sandpaper just to smooth it out a little more. Looks pretty good. And for the next step, we're going to make our cover for the sound holes that will allow the air to travel up through here, travel this direction, and then down and across our sharp edge that we previously made. And to do that, we're going to use a small piece of 3/4 inch pipe, and I'll show you how to make that next. So here I have a short piece of Schedule 40 3/4 inch PVC pipe. It's quite a bit thicker. The walls are much thicker than this pipe, but that doesn't matter. We're only using this as a cover to go over this section to channel the air to make the sound for our flute. And to do that, we need the length of this piece of 3/4 inch pipe to be exactly from this first edge of the 3-inch hole that we previously made, and travel beyond this outer lip here and end anywhere between this round area that's remaining on our flute, between our 2-inch hole and where we blow into the hole. So this is the area where we need to make sure that we have the length to cover. So what I'm going to do is just take a visual reference here, and anywhere between the P and the R on this printing, on this piece of 3/4 inch PVC, I can cut right here and then work on making this into the sound hole cover that channels the air. So I shortened this piece of Schedule 40 PVC pipe, 3/4 inch, into a section that will cover this hole completely, start at this edge of this hole, and end on the rounded portion behind this lip that we filed earlier. That will allow the air to travel up through this hole and down across this sharp edge right here. But the next step I want to do is make it so this is a little easier to fit onto here, because right now you'd have a heck of a time getting it over there. So what I want to do is cut it in two places on the back side. Remove that from my vise, open my vise up, and I've already got a split line here from something I was previously doing with this, and I'm just going to place that nice and snug and take a hacksaw, use my thumbnail as a guide, and just try to stay as close to 90 degrees as possible while cutting this lengthwise, getting it started. Keeping it as straight as possible. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit crooked. Now I'm going to rotate it about a quarter turn, possibly a little less. A quarter's probably good. And then I'm going to use my thumb and do the same thing to cut a section out of this PVC pipe. And you see where I had it cut previously, that piece fell out. But yours will still need to be cut just like this. So just get it started. And once you do, you can remove your thumb and make a good straight cut as best you can. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is just to make it easier to get on and off of your flute. And what you're left with is a piece of PVC that looks like this. Just has that section removed. For the next step, we need something inside this flute to fill this area between these two holes, and no bigger than that. Just from this edge to this edge, from this edge to this edge, and that's as far as we want it. From this edge to this edge, we need to fill the inside of this flute. To do that, I'm going to use a wine bottle cork and take a measurement of the distance between the two holes, and it is exactly 7/8 inch. So we want this cork to be 7/8 inch. So I'm going to take a pencil and mark my cork at 7/8. And this doesn't have to be exact. In fact, it's better to make it a little heavy than light, because if it's heavy, you can always sand it down, file it down, Dremel it down to get it to the right length. So now we're going to cut it. Same way with the other one. Just line up my mark, and I like to put it right on the edge of my vise, so I can use the edge of my vise kind of as a guide to get it nice and straight. Make sure it's good and tight, and then cut it as close to the edge as I can to keep it straight. Another thing you could use on this would be a miter saw or a miter saw box, but just use precautions if you're using power tools to do this, so your fingers are never in jeopardy. Now that I've got this cut, I can check the length, and you'll see I'm a little bit heavy on that, which is good. So what I'm going to do is finish shaping this cork. And the way to do that, I like to use a Dremel tool. Power all the way on. And I'm going to shrink the outer diameter of this cork until I can get it inside my flute. So that's about right on the end. So now I'm just going to Dremel down these edges to match. So now that's going to push in there pretty tight. Before I put it in there, I want to double check. And I do need to take a little more off of the end. That looks pretty good. Now I'm going to push one end into my flute, and I'm going to use the edge of my table, and with a pushing and twisting motion I'm going to force that cork down into that flute. This takes quite a bit of pressure, but it will go just by twisting it and putting a lot of pressure on it. And once you get all the way flush to this point, so it looks like that. There's my cork. I'm going to take a dowel rod that is a little smaller and fits inside. I'm going to push it from this end against the table and get it to go farther in there. Once that gets started, you want to watch through your holes, and you can see the cork is passed here, and you want to get it all the way into position until it's right on the edge of the inside here. Now I've gone too far, so I put my dowel rod in the other end and just adjust it back just to the edge. You don't want it hanging over the edge, you want it right against the edge. And I realize you can't see that very clearly, but that's right on it. Once that's done, this is our piece that we previously made. We're just going to get it in position at the end of the flute, brace it against our body, using our fingers to spread it a little. We just work it over the end. Once you get it over the end, you can just twist until you get it down where it needs to go. And at this point, I want it right on the edge, same as the cork. And there I am. So now what we have is our flute holes covered with the 3/4 pipe that we previously made, and our basic body of our flute is done. Has the 2 holes one under here and one right at the edge here, and we've got our cork down inside there right up to the back edge where that matches. So your cork should match the edge of your sound hole cover. The next step is to get it to a key of A for this flute, and to do that we're going to use this guitar tuner and just blow through the end. And we can see we're at an A, but we're way off. It needs to be right in the center here. To do that, we're going to shorten this flute, and after making a bunch of these, I can tell by the distance that I am off of a key about how much I need to remove. And in this instance, I'm going to be taking off probably as much as a 1/2 inch, but I'm going to do it at about 1/8 of an inch increments until I get close. And then I'm going to use a file until I can hit it exactly on a key of A. So I'm just going to shorten this end of the flute to bring the key up higher until it's right on the A. So now I've just cut off several times, cut a little bit, then check it on my guitar tuner, cut a little bit and check it on my guitar tuner until I've gotten very close to a key of A. You can see it's just below the center line. So what I'll do is take my file and just take a little off at a time until I'm exact. Keeping the file nice and flat. Rotate the flute a little every now and then to make sure I'm staying at 90 degrees until I'm right on a key of A. Keep checking it with the guitar tuner. You can also use apps for your phone, but I'm old school, so I do it this way. And there you see I'm dead on the key of A. And the bass of the flute, the bass note of the flute, comes from this hole, which is the overall length of the flute. And your flute, the length could vary a little bit, which is why you want to start at 16.5 inches, because the distance of your hole where you file it, little increments, can change the length of your overall flute in order to get the perfect A key. One other note, when playing these and testing them while creating them, you blow very softly because it's such a perfect cylindrical shape to make a flute out of. Unlike some wood which absorbs sound, it really requires very little breath to make that perfect note. So you barely need to breathe into the flute when you're playing it, which is, I think, a good thing, because you can sustain notes for much longer than traditional flutes. A couple other advantages to this is, in a traditional Native American style flute that's made from any type of wood, all flutes are going to get what's called wet out. When you blow for a long period of time through the end of a flute, condensation builds up between the 2 flute holes. and that causes what's called wet out. To get rid of wet out in a traditional flute, you usually either need to stop playing the flute and let it sit and dry, or you need to take the flute apart, clean it, dry it, and put it back together before you can continue playing it. With this style of flute, when it gets wet out, all you have to do is give a real hard blow through the end of it to clear it, and then wipe it and continue playing. That's another great advantage to these. They also need no oiling or anything, obviously, because they're just PVC pipe designed to carry water in the first place. And this doesn't have to be exact. This is a Native American inspired flute design. It's not a symphonically tuned flute. If you want to make a symphonically tuned flute, you can do that. With a little research online, you can find the charts to make the hole diameters and the distance exactly what you want. For this flute, we're going to make them in a style that Native Americans made them for centuries. And they sound beautiful. Now that we have the basic flute built in a nice clear key of A, we want to create our finger holes. To do that, we're going to mark from the exact center of our sound hole 4 1/8 inches and put a line across our flute right at our center line. Once we've got that line marked at 4 1/8 from the center of this hole, we can make the rest of our holes. For our next hole, we're going to move 1 inch down and put a line across. Then we're going to skip a hole, and we're going to do our next hole 2 inches from the previous, and then 2 more at 1 inch increments until we have 5 holes. Our first hole again, 4 1/8 from the center of this hole, and then 1 inch, skip a hole, 1 inch, 1 inch, 1 inch. So our bottom hole is roughly 3 3/4 inches, and our top hole is 4 1/8 from the center of this hole. From the end of the flute, our bottom hole is about 3 3/4. Next step we want to do is create our drill bit positioning holes so our drill bit doesn't slip from side to side. To do that, I'm going to use a soldering iron. So let me plug that up and get that heated. While that's heating, I'm going to change my drill bit. So I'm going to use a 7/32 size bit for my finger holes. And I'll set that aside and wait for my soldering iron to get hot. Now before I start making the holes with my soldering iron, I'm going to look down the length of my flute to see how accurate I was with keeping this centered, and you can tell by the point of where you filed in relation to your center line. And I can tell that my center line is a little off from the way I filed because I didn't keep it exactly 90 degrees. So to compensate for that, I'm going to go about that far from the side of my center line to my marks for my holes to put my drill bit indicators or drill bit positioning holes. So I'm going to take my soldering iron, I'm going to line it up with the mark that I made and go a little bit to the side that I need to, and not press hard, just a brief tap so I don't go through the material. I just make a little indentation that will allow my drill bit to follow. And I'm going to do that on all 5 of the holes that I made. And that's it for the soldering iron, so I'm going to unplug that. Now that I have my drill holes all marked with my pencil and then indented with my soldering iron, I've got all 5 of them laid out. I'm going to use my drill with my 7/32 bit, place the center in each one of the indentions, hold the drill at 90 degrees, and drill each hole. This is thin material, so it doesn't take much, and you don't want to scar the opposite inside edge any more than necessary, so try not to use too much downward pressure when you're drilling these holes, and just go in and out. Don't spend a lot of time altering those holes or making them larger or slanted. Just try to be as efficient as possible, just once in, once out while the drill's running, to minimize the burrs and damage that you do to the holes. At this point, I want to do the same thing I did with the sandpaper before, and that's to wrap it around that piece of material and slide it inside the flute and just sand lightly the undersides of the holes that I just drilled. That will get rid of any of the burrs or markings that may have been left behind, and further smooth the interior of your sound chamber. When that's done, I like to take the small round file that I used before and just very lightly go around each hole, removing any stray strands of PVC material that may be still hanging in there. And I'm not taking off any material really, just smoothing it out. This helps the clarity of each note. Once that's done, I'm going to take a small piece of extra sandpaper and just roll it up until it will fit inside the hole. And I'm just going to push it down in there and twist it a little on each hole. Just to give each hole a finishing touch. Once that's done, you can test play your flute. Not bad. Sounds pretty good. Now we want to do the detail work that allows it to look really nice. It doesn't change the sound of it, but it makes it visually more appealing, I suppose. And I've sold quite a few of these locally, and people seem to love the finish that I end up with. So here's how I do that. First thing you want to do is take this off, and you want to do that by twisting it and pulling it. And it still has some sharp corners, so be careful. Once you get that off, we'll start with that. We're going to take our file And we're going to pushing down with our file. We're just going to do a rapid motion until we get the edges very nice and smooth. Turning a little bit each time will help ensure you stay 90 degrees. Good for that side. Flip it over and do the other side. Now that edge is nice and smooth. You want to make sure you protect this inside edge here. You don't want to file that or mess with that at all, because that needs to be nice and sharp without any burrs hanging off or anything. So leave that interior edge right there alone. But get your two ends nice and flat. Okay, once you've got that done, we can move on to filing this inner edge here. We want to file that down. So to do that, I'll just hold my file at an angle that allows me to take off that material. This one is not as critical as these edges, but just to give it a better look, I like to get them pretty smooth. Do that on both sides. Looking better. Still got a ways to go on that one. Once you've got those two edges satisfactory, now what I like to do is smooth off these sharp points here. And to do that, I just hold it flat on the file, give it a few passes just to take off the edge. Pretty good. Now I'm going to go around the outer rings and at an angle and just smooth these over a little and try to keep it even and uniform as possible. Doesn't have to be perfect. Sandpaper later will even it out, but you want to knock off these sharp corners and just go around your edge a couple of times on the outside only. I'm just following the contour of the outer ring. Here I'm going to do the same thing, knock off these sharp edges and then go around the outer edge a couple of times. It's these little small details that will separate the looks of these PVC flutes from ones that aren't made as intentionally nice to look at, I guess. So once you've got your file work done, you can move on to the next stage. And that don't worry about all these little pieces that your file left hanging off, because they're going to go when you move to the sandpaper stage. Just get it a little rounder, just so it's nicer to look at. And now, on the body of the flute, I'm just going to brace it against my body and do the same thing, but just turn it a little as I'm filing, just to give it a rounder edge so it doesn't have that sharpness to it. And just smoothing it over with a few passes until it kind of looks uniformed, and then angle my file a little more toward the center of the flute and just to give it a little more rounding, a little more comfort when playing. So that's rounded that edge off. Flip it over, do the same thing to this end. Now this end doesn't come in contact with your mouth, and you want to be careful not to take off a lot of material down here, because this is where your perfect note of A is. So once you get that rounded a little, angle your file in a little more, and just take a little tiny bit of time to round that off, and just to give it a more professional look to it. Now we're going to move on to the sandpaper stage, and for this I'm using a 100 grit sandpaper, pretty coarse but not ridiculously so. Sand each end, and then the very important part is to go lengthwise with the sandpaper, which is making tiny little microscopic, what looks like grain lines in the PVC pipe, while cleaning it up at the same time. And I'm going to be getting rid of that lettering. We want it to look like a wooden flute, but have all the benefits of a zero maintenance PVC flute, as well as the clearer sound and tone of a PVC flute. There are some fantastic flute makers who do use traditional materials, be it bamboo or cedar or even maple and hickory, and those flutes sound fantastic, but they can also be pretty expensive. But I would say they are definitely worth your time and investment if you want to get one of those flutes, because they're really beautiful instruments, both artistically and musically. So just because you can make a PVC flute, I definitely don't want to discourage anyone from buying some of the wood flutes. But this will give this flute the grain lines that it needs to look really pretty, hopefully, when we're finished. So just keep going around with the 100 grit sandpaper until your surface is really scratched lengthwise. And you can use your material just to knock off some sharp corners or sharp edges. And when you're done, you probably can't see those grain lines, but I can see a little bit of the lettering there is still on here. So I'm going to hit that with a little extra pressure, just to get those letters off, always going lengthwise while sanding. And if you're just going to paint your flute, you don't need to worry about all this sanding. But I like the flutes that I make to look like real wood, and the technique that I have developed comes out pretty good. Just spending a little time and some extra detail work on this piece, so it'll be done and ready for stain. And that looks pretty good. Now, if you get all the dust off of it, you want to wash these pieces after you're done. Another advantage to the PVC flute is, they're waterproof, so you can just wash them. You'll notice that I did not mess with this edge here or here, because those edges from about there to there are going to be very important to the sound that your flute makes through the air travel. So that piece is pretty much done. It's got the grain lines in from the sandpaper. It's got the edges rounded off a little with the file and sanded, and it's ready to go be washed, wiped, and dried. And then we'll move to the stain process. Next we're going to sand our flute, the base body of our flute. And to do that, same thing, you want to keep the direction of your sandpaper going the length of your flute. Always sand in these kinds of strokes. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of the lettering, and I'm just putting a mild pressure on my sandpaper. And you'll see that lettering comes off pretty easily, and the grain lines that I need are left behind. Still just moving up the flute, sanding with light pressure. Now I'm going to flip it and still going the length of the flute to sand it. Finish getting these letters off. Always doing long strokes as I can. And I'll finish it with some really long strokes just to get some nice long grain lines. Now I'm just going to rotate it as I'm sanding to get grain lines all the way around and make sure that my PVC pipe is unblemished. And you'll notice I have it propped on a little piece of cardboard to keep from scarring it while I'm rotating it. That's why I use this cardboard in the vise whenever I have it clamped, is to keep from getting any deep scars in it. And here you see the old lines that I had made for our 2 holes, and I'm just going to sand those off as well. And now I'm getting over to the center line, and I'll just sand that. Sand the whole body of the flute lengthwise. Be careful not to sand too much around this edge, because that is your sound edge, but you can hit it lightly, and we'll hit it with a finer grit sandpaper later anyway. So I've gone over just about the whole flute. Again, I'm not trying to take off a lot of material. I'm more interested in just scuffing up the outer surface. And I'm going to finish by doing some long strokes all the way around. Flip it around and do the other side. Slowly rotating while I'm sanding, making sure if I see any blemishes or indentions in the PVC, I give that some extra attention. And you might be able to see the grain lines. I'm not sure on this camera, but you can see the little hairs that are coming off that are leaving the grain lines by penetrating and removing just tiny little bits of the PVC in a long line type motion. Now I've gone all the way around. I'm just going to give it some really long straight strokes. All the way around. Hit this side again. And then I'm going to take my sandpaper at a little bit of an angle and just make this edge a little smoother. By rotating, sanding at an angle. And the last part for the sandpaper is I'm taking a 320 grit piece of wet dry sandpaper, and I'm just lightly going over that quickly just to get rid of some of the burrs and little bits and pieces that the heavy grit sandpaper left behind. And that will still retain my grain lines, but just lessen a lot of the extra particles that I don't want on there. Give my ends another tap. One more thing I like to do is take the little piece that I used for the sound holes and just hold it at an angle and just hit this edge where your mouth is going to be on it to blow, and just knock that edge back just a little bit, just to make sure that there's no discomfort when you're playing your flute. And be careful also not to ride up with the sandpaper where you've got your nice grain pattern. We're just hitting this inside edge. And that's good. So at this point, it's ready to be washed, wiped, and we'll move on to the staining process after it's dry. Now that we've finished the construction of our flute and we've sanded it to add the grain lines in both pieces, and we've washed it and dried it, we're now ready to move on to the stain portion of our flute making. To do that, we're going to need 5 things. Our 2 pieces of our flute, a regular brown shoe polish. We're going to be using a food container lid turned upside down, and we need a long dowel rod that will fit inside our flute. Then we're going to use the applicator that comes on top of the shoe polish to stain our flute. And what we want to do first is use the upside down container to make sure that we have plenty of shoe polish distributed on our applicator. Then we're going to hold our small part, our flute hole cover, by the sides, and we're going to tap to apply the stain, the shoe polish stain, to each end. Just tapping, being careful not to get it on the interior of this part. Then we're going to turn it, and we're just going to swipe along the inner edge, again trying to avoid getting any shoe polish inside the chamber of the sound hole cover. We're going to do that on both sides. Making sure that we've got it pretty well covered. Once that's done, we're going to set that aside, placing it in our food container cover. Then we're going to take our flute, the main body of it, place it onto the dowel rod, slide it all the way up till it touches the cork, and then using long strokes, we're going to cover the flute. This is just the first coating, and we just want to go from one end to the other and make sure that we get the whole flute covered in a brown color. Use full length strokes when you're doing this. All the way from one end to the other, just until the whole flute is covered once. Probably about 2 times around, maybe more depending on your shoe polish and how saturated it was when you started. And you can begin to see the flute starts to look like it has a wood grain to it at this point. Just a few more strokes, just to make sure we're covered. Visually inspecting it as you go, making sure that you're getting it evenly coated as possible. And this doesn't have to be perfect. The variations of the different darknesses and lightnesses are what makes your flute unique. So I'm going to say that's good for the first coat, and I'm going to set that aside to dry. While the main part of the flute is drying,
I'm going to insert my finger into the Soundhole cover part that I was working on previously, and without touching the edges or ends too much, I'm just going to go along and do the same thing and give this a good coat of brown. By going in elongated strokes. That looks pretty good. Now, what you want to do is avoid doing this for a long period of time, because you're going to go back later and add some visual detail. But you want to give this a chance to dry before you add too much shoe polish to it. So if you look at it up close, if you can see it up close, it looks pretty much wood grained as it is. You want to carefully set it back down on this lid so it doesn't stick when it dries. So our flute parts have had an opportunity to dry. It's been about 30 minutes. And what I want to do now is again make sure that the applicator tip is saturated, and I'm just going to touch it and twist it on each end just to make sure that the ends are coated. Don't put enough pressure to let the shoe polish soak down into the flute, just enough to get a little on the ends. At this point, I'm going to return this part to the dowel rod. Carefully sliding it up to the cork. I'm trying to handle it gently right now because it's only had a half an hour to dry, so it's barely dried. You can wait a lot longer if you'd like, but I'm too impatient. And now I'm going to add some visual interest to this flute. And you can see, even the first coating, it already has some darker areas and some lighter areas, and it looks pretty nice. But what I want it to do is right along the finger holes, maybe even the sound hole, to have it look like that's the center of the log that it was fashioned from. And to do that, I'm just going to start where I left off and add some visual interest by dragging in a swooping type motion across the areas where I want it to look like it's the center of the log. And if you go too much with this, it gets too thick and starts looking unrealistic. So that's pretty good right there. Now I have what looks like a really light section going right down, almost down the middle, but a little bit to one side, giving it a more natural look. I'm going to go up here to the very top and do that as well, just to make it look like that was a real section of a limb that this came out of. Now I'm going to rotate it over and do the other side the same way. Again, just long swooping strokes about halfway down, just to give it a little more visual interest of lighter and darker areas to make it look like it's real wood grain. And I'm rotating it and doing the same thing. One thing to remember here is don't overdo it. Less is more. If you overdo it, it starts looking like dark globs instead of real wood streaks. And as you can see, right now that looks pretty close to wood. And I'm going to call that done on that part and return this to the stand. I just have a 2x4 with holes drilled in it that the dowel rod fits in. That's how I dry the flute. Now,
I want to go back to the Soundhole cover part, and I want to sort of match the design that I did on the main body of the flute by noting that this is the bottom, so this would be the top. So I'm going to do a stripe right down the middle that sort of matches what I just did on the main body of the flute. And there you can see, once that lines up close to what I did on the other part of the flute, these two will match, almost making it look like it came from the same piece of material. And I'll show you that after it dries. Set that back to dry again. Now that I have both pieces of my flute with the wood grain look that I like from the shoe polish, I'm going to place this right up to the edge where it was before. I'm going to place the Soundhole cover onto the flute by placing it on my waistline, holding it in position, spreading it, and sliding it straight down as much as possible while spreading it, pushing it downward. What I'm trying to avoid is removing the finish that we already put. And as you can see, I've got it right to the edge. Now I want to check it for level, and I see I need to turn a little bit. That's pretty good right there. So what I want is this opening to be on the exact bottom, so the flute will stand upright for the most part. Now I want to check where I slid the Soundhole cover over and see if there are any areas that need to be touched up. And I'm going to add a couple of dabs back onto the end here. And give just a couple of swipes just to knock the shine off where I slid the flute hole cover on. Very light pressure. That looks pretty good. Couple of swipes where I was handling it. And these just add a little more visual interest. And now you can see the flute is ready for Clearcoat, which is the final stage after it dries. So both coats of shoe polish are dry, and now we're going to add our Clearcoat. We're going to use a crystal clear enamel spray can, and we want to keep it about 7 or 8 inches away from the flute when we're spraying it, and we want to avoid overspraying. That's the main thing. If you spray in one spot, you're going to get runs and it's not going to look good. So we want to do a light coating on this, and we want to do that from a distance of about 7 or 8 inches. So here we go. Just about 2 passes, and then a quarter turn I'll rotate. 2 passes, a quarter turn I'll rotate. And I'll do that all the way around until I've got one coating. Now stop and let it dry. Avoid the temptation to continue spraying Clearcoat on there because it looks shiny and pretty. Let that first coat dry and then repeat this about 3 times and you'll end up with a flute that looks like this.